The river moved slowly that autumn, carrying with it the smell of diesel and rust, the scent of industry that clung to every corner of the dockyard like a second skin. Along the water's edge, shipping containers stood stacked in towering columns, their metal sides streaked with rain and salt, each one a sealed vault of commerce and mystery. It was here, in the shadow of these iron giants, that a man named Gareth Loomis spent his days, a dock worker whose hands knew the weight of cargo and whose eyes had learned to read the subtle language of manifest sheets and bills of lading. He was a man of routine, of clockwork precision, and when he failed to return home one October evening in 1993, the rhythm of the dockyard faltered, if only for a moment, before grinding forward again as it always did. The disappearance was noted first by his wife, a woman named Elaine who had married Gareth when they were both too young to understand what promises meant. She waited by the kitchen window that night, watching the street for his truck, a battered vehicle that always announced itself with a rattling exhaust and a creak of tired suspension. When midnight came and went, she called the dockyard office, her voice tight with worry, but the night supervisor could offer little comfort. Gareth had clocked out at his usual time, 6:15 in the evening, and had walked toward the parking lot like he did every day. No one had seen him after that. The truck was found 3 days later, abandoned in a lot near the industrial district, keys still in the ignition, driver's door left ajar as though he had stepped out for just a moment and intended to return. The police investigation was brief and inconclusive, hampered by the transient nature of dock work, where men came and went with the tides of employment, where questions were rarely asked and answers even more rarely given. Gareth had no enemies that anyone knew of, no debts that would attract the wrong kind of attention, no secrets that his wife could name. He was, by all accounts, unremarkable in the way that working men often are, defined more by what he did than who he was. The detectives assigned to the case followed the usual paths, interviewing co-workers and reviewing time cards, searching for patterns in the chaos of the shipping logs, but the trail grew cold quickly. Within weeks, Gareth Loomis became another name in a file cabinet, another unsolved mystery in a city that had seen its share of them. But there were whispers, quiet conversations held in the break rooms and smoking areas of the dockyard, talk of irregularities in the shipping manifests, of containers that arrived without proper documentation, of cargo that moved through the facility under the cover of night. Gareth had been involved in receiving one such shipment, a container that had come in on a freighter from overseas, its contents listed only as industrial equipment, a designation vague enough to avoid scrutiny. He had been the one to sign for it, to supervise its unloading and placement in a holding area away from the main flow of traffic. Those who worked alongside him that day remembered his unease, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he checked the paperwork, the way his eyes had darted toward the container's sealed doors, as though he could see through the metal to whatever lay inside. The container itself became part of the mystery, sitting untouched in its designated spot for weeks after Gareth vanished. When officials finally opened it as part of the investigation, they found exactly what the manifest claimed: industrial equipment, crates of machine parts and tools, nothing that would explain a man's disappearance. The container was resealed and eventually shipped to its intended destination, another transaction completed, another piece of commerce moving through the arteries of global trade. For years, it seemed that whatever secrets it held had left with it, sealed away forever behind corrugated steel walls. Gareth's life before that October evening had been shaped by the rhythms of physical labor and modest ambition. He had grown up in a neighborhood where work was sacred, where men measured their worth by the steadiness of their employment and the reliability of their paychecks. His father had worked the docks before him, a lineage of manual labor that stretched back through generations, and Gareth had followed that path without question or complaint. He was good at his job, precise and careful, the kind of worker that supervisors valued for his attention to detail, and his ability to spot discrepancies in paperwork that others might miss. It was this skill that had led to his assignment that autumn day, tasked with receiving a shipment that required discretion and thoroughness. Elaine remembered the weeks leading up to his disappearance as ordinary, defined by the small routines that made up their life together. Mornings began with coffee at the kitchen table, Gareth reading the newspaper while she prepared his lunch, conversations that revolved around mundane concerns like bills and home repairs and plans for the weekend. He had seemed distracted in those final days, she would later tell investigators, quieter than usual, his thoughts turning inward in a way that was unlike him. When she asked if something was troubling him, he would smile and shake his head, deflecting her concern with reassurances that everything was fine, that work was just busy, that nothing was wrong. She believed him because she wanted to, because the alternative was to acknowledge that something had shifted beneath the surface of their life, something she couldn't name or control. The dockyard where Gareth worked was a sprawling complex of warehouses and loading zones, a landscape of concrete and steel that stretched along the riverfront for nearly a mile. It operated at the intersection of legitimate commerce and the kind of gray areas that exist in any major shipping hub, places where oversight is inconsistent and documentation can be flexible. Most of what moved through the facility was unremarkable, consumer goods and raw materials, the building blocks of everyday life. But there were always whispers of other things, shipments that arrived with minimal paperwork, containers that moved through the system faster than usual, transactions that involved cash payments and handshake agreements rather than official contracts. Gareth had been aware of this undercurrent, had seen enough over the years to understand that the dockyard operated by its own rules, but he had never been directly involved in anything questionable until that autumn shipment arrived. The freighter that carried the container had come from overseas, its route taking it through several ports before arriving at the city's waterfront. The manifest listed the container's contents as machinery, a designation broad enough to encompass almost anything, and the receiving paperwork was signed by a company that existed only as a post office box and a phone number that rang endlessly without answer. These were red flags that Gareth would have recognized, signs that the shipment existed in that gray zone between legal and illegal, but he had been given explicit instructions by his supervisor to process it without delay, to ask no questions, and to ensure that it was placed in a secure location away from the main traffic flow. He had followed those instructions, but the unease that his coworkers noticed suggested that he understood the implications of what he was being asked to do. The night of his disappearance, Gareth had clocked out at his usual time, exchanging brief words with the evening shift workers as he headed toward the parking lot. The weather had been cool and overcast, the kind of gray October evening that signaled the approach of winter, and he had been wearing his work jacket, a canvas coat stained with grease and worn at the elbows. One coworker remembered seeing him pause at the edge of the lot, standing beside his truck but not getting in, his gaze directed back toward the dockyard as though he had forgotten something or was considering going back. Then the coworker had turned away, distracted by his own departure, and when he looked again, Gareth was gone. The truck remained where it had been parked, but there was no sign of the man himself. In the days that followed, Elaine tried to piece together her husband's final hours, searching for clues in the mundane details of their life. She went through his belongings, looking for anything that might explain his disappearance, but found only the expected detritus of a working man's existence: work gloves and receipts, pocket change and expired lottery tickets. His wallet had been in the truck, still containing his driver's license and a small amount of cash, which ruled out robbery as a motive. His lunch box, which he always brought home to be washed and refilled, was missing, suggesting that he had taken it with him when he left the truck, though no one could say why or where he might have gone. The police investigation focused initially on the possibility of foul play, interviewing anyone who might have had contact with Gareth in the hours before he vanished. His supervisor, a man named Dalton Kerr, insisted that Gareth had seemed normal that day, focused on his work and showing no signs of distress. When questioned about the container shipment, Dalton became defensive, insisting that everything had been handled according to procedure, that there was nothing unusual about the cargo or the way it had been processed. The detectives noted his evasiveness but had no grounds to press further, no evidence that connected the shipment to Gareth's disappearance beyond coincidence and speculation. Weeks became months, and the case grew colder with each passing season. Elaine held onto hope for a time, believing that Gareth would return with an explanation, that there had been some misunderstanding or emergency that had pulled him away. But as winter turned to spring and spring to summer, that hope hardened into something else, a kind of resigned grief that acknowledged loss without understanding its cause. She kept his belongings as they were, his clothes still hanging in the closet, his coffee cup still sitting in the kitchen cabinet, a shrine to a man who had simply stopped existing in the world. Friends and family urged her to move forward, to accept that he was gone, but acceptance required answers she didn't have, closure that remained perpetually out of reach. The dockyard continued to operate as it always had, the absence of one worker barely registering in the larger machinery of commerce. New employees were hired, old ones retired or moved on, and the memory of Gareth Loomis faded into the background noise of workplace gossip and urban legend. The container that had been the last thing he signed for was long gone, shipped to its destination and likely emptied and reused a dozen times over, its contents dispersed into the world without leaving a trace. For all practical purposes, the mystery had no resolution, no satisfying conclusion that would tie together the loose threads of that October evening. But mysteries have a way of persisting, of lingering in the collective memory of a place, and the dockyard workers who had known Gareth spoke of him occasionally, usually in hushed tones during night shifts when the facility was quiet, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. They told stories of strange sounds coming from the area where the container had been stored, of shadows that moved when no one was there, of an unease that settled over anyone who spent too much time in that particular section of the yard. These were the embellishments that grow around unsolved disappearances, the folklore that fills the void left by absent facts, but beneath the superstition was a genuine sense that something had happened there, something that had never been properly explained or resolved. Years passed, and the world moved on as it always does. The dockyard changed ownership, new management bringing new procedures and updated technology that gradually transformed the facility from its industrial past into something more modern and efficient. Old shipping records were digitized, ancient filing cabinets were emptied and discarded, and the physical landscape of the yard was reconfigured to accommodate larger vessels and increased cargo volume. It was during this process of modernization that the container reappeared, not the original unit but one that had been in long-term storage, sitting forgotten in a warehouse that was slated for demolition. When workers finally opened it to catalog its contents before disposal, they found something that had been missed during the original investigation, objects that suggested Gareth Loomis had not been alone in whatever had transpired that October evening so many years before. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning in early spring, when the air still carried the bite of winter, but the light had begun to stretch longer across the dockyard. A demolition crew had been tasked with clearing out Warehouse 7, a structure that had stood empty for nearly 5 years, its purpose obsolete in the new configuration of the facility. The building had served as long-term storage for containers that were in legal limbo, units whose ownership was disputed, or whose contents required extended customs review. Most had been cleared out years before, but 3 remained at the back of the warehouse, covered in dust and largely forgotten by everyone except the records clerk who had discovered their existence while digitizing old inventory logs. When the crew pried open the first container, they found exactly what they expected: industrial parts that had long since become worthless, components for machinery that no longer existed, the detritus of failed businesses and abandoned shipments. The second container held similar contents, and they approached the third with the same casual efficiency, expecting nothing of consequence. The doors opened with a metallic groan, hinges protesting years of disuse, and afternoon light spilled into the interior, illuminating something that made the foreman step back and reach for his phone. Inside, arranged with an almost careful deliberation, were personal belongings that clearly didn't match the official manifest. A canvas work jacket hung from a hook that had been welded to the container's interior wall, its pockets still holding the outline of whatever had once filled them. Beneath it sat a metal lunch box, its surface spotted with rust but still intact, the name Loomis barely visible on a strip of masking tape that had been adhered to the lid. Nearby, a pair of work boots stood side by side, their laces still tied, positioned in a way that suggested they had been removed rather than discarded. And scattered across the floor, partially buried under the industrial equipment that filled most of the space, were dozens of cigarette butts, all of the same brand, evidence that someone had spent considerable time inside this sealed metal box. The police were called immediately, and within hours the warehouse became a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across entrances and forensic teams moving through the space with practiced precision. The container was photographed from every angle, its contents cataloged with meticulous care, each item bagged and labeled for further analysis. News of the discovery spread quickly through the community, reaching Elaine Loomis through a phone call from a reporter who had somehow obtained her number. She listened to the questions with a numbness that had become familiar over the years, a protective distance that allowed her to hear the words without fully absorbing their meaning. When she finally understood what had been found, she sat down at her kitchen table, the same table where she had waited for Gareth to come home all those years ago, and allowed herself to feel something she had trained herself to suppress: hope, fragile and painful, that she might finally have answers. Detective Sarah Winters, who had been assigned to cold cases after 20 years in homicide, took charge of the reopened investigation. She had been a rookie patrol officer when Gareth disappeared, too junior to be involved in the original case, but she remembered the stories, the way veteran detectives had spoken about it in the break room with frustration and resignation. Now, with the evidence laid out in the department's forensic lab, she began the painstaking work of reconstructing what had happened in that container 2 decades earlier. The lunch box yielded no fingerprints beyond Gareth's own, but inside she found a thermos that still held the dried residue of coffee, a sandwich wrapper, and a folded piece of paper that had survived the years remarkably intact. The note was written in Gareth's handwriting, verified against samples from old birthday cards and work documents that Elaine had preserved. The message was brief, written with the shaky script of someone under stress. If something happens, look for DKHE knows about the shipment. They said it was equipment, but I saw the crates being moved at night. I should have kept my mouth shut. The initials DK were underlined twice, and Sarah immediately recognized them as belonging to Dalton Care, the supervisor who had been questioned during the original investigation and who had since retired from the dockyard and moved to a coastal town 3 hours away. The cigarette butts provided DNA evidence, and forensic analysis revealed that they came from at least 2 different individuals. One set matched Gareth's DNA, obtained from samples taken from his hairbrush and toothbrush that Elaine had kept in a box in her attic, items she had been unable to discard despite the passage of time. The other set remained unidentified, belonging to someone not in the criminal database, but their presence confirmed what the arrangement of personal items had suggested. Gareth had not been alone in that container. The work boots, when examined more closely, showed scuff marks consistent with someone pacing in a confined space, the soles worn in a pattern that suggested hours of restless movement. The jacket, when tested for trace evidence, revealed fibers from materials not listed on the original manifest, suggesting that the container had indeed held cargo beyond what had been officially documented. Sarah drove to interview Dalton Care on a morning when fog rolled in from the ocean, obscuring the coastal highway and forcing her to drive slowly through the gray murk. She found him living in a small house overlooking the water, a man in his 70s now, his face weathered by sun and time. He met her at the door with suspicion that immediately shifted to resignation when she explained why she had come. They sat in his living room, surrounded by nautical decorations and photographs of grandchildren, and Sarah watched as he seemed to age before her eyes, the weight of 2 decades of secrets finally becoming too heavy to carry. Dalton spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, telling a story that had never been officially recorded. The shipment that Gareth had signed for had not contained industrial equipment, or at least not entirely. The majority of the container's space had been filled with legitimate cargo, machine parts that matched the manifest, but hidden among those crates had been smaller boxes containing pharmaceuticals, prescription medications that had been diverted from overseas manufacturers, and were being smuggled into the country for resale on the black market. Dalton had been paid to facilitate the shipment's passage through the dockyard, to ensure that inspections were cursory, and that the container was stored in a location where it could be accessed by the buyers without drawing attention. Gareth had discovered the discrepancy, Dalton explained, his voice thick with regret. He had been too careful, too thorough, and while checking the container's contents against the manifest, he had noticed that some of the crates didn't match their listed weights. When he had reported this to Dalton, expressing concern that there might be a documentation error, the supervisor had tried to deflect, to convince him that it was just a minor inconsistency, nothing worth pursuing. But Gareth had been troubled by it, and in the days that followed, he had started asking questions, talking to other workers about unusual shipments, trying to piece together whether this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. The people behind the smuggling operation had learned of Gareth's inquiries, Dalton said, through channels that he had never fully understood but had always feared. On the evening of the disappearance, Gareth had been approached in the parking lot by 2 men who claimed they needed to discuss the shipment with him, that there had been an accounting error they wanted to resolve. He had gone with them, Dalton believed, because he trusted that it was a legitimate business matter, a conversation that would clear up the confusion. What happened after that, Dalton insisted, he didn't know for certain. He had been told the next day that the situation had been handled, that Gareth wouldn't be causing any more problems, and when the worker failed to return, Dalton had understood the terrible implication of those words. Sarah listened to the confession with a mixture of anger and pity, recording every word while maintaining the professional composure that years of police work had taught her. She asked about the container, about why Gareth's belongings had been found there, and Dalton's face crumpled as he explained what he believed had occurred. The men had likely taken Gareth to the container, he said, intending to intimidate him into silence, to show him the consequences of asking too many questions. The personal items suggested that Gareth had been held there for some period of time, possibly overnight, trapped in the darkness with someone who was meant to ensure his compliance. What happened next, whether Gareth had been released and then disappeared through other means, or whether something worse had occurred inside that metal box, Dalton claimed not to know. The investigation expanded rapidly, old shipping records pulled from archives, and cross-referenced with dates and names that Dalton provided. The pharmaceutical smuggling operation had continued for years after Gareth's disappearance, only shutting down when federal authorities had cracked a larger network, and several key players had been arrested on unrelated charges. Some of those individuals were now serving time in federal prison, while others had died or disappeared into retirement, their involvement in the dockyard operation buried under layers of bureaucracy and failed prosecutions. Sarah worked with federal agents to track down anyone who might have information about what had happened to Gareth, but most trails led nowhere. Witnesses who wouldn't talk or couldn't be found, evidence that had been destroyed or never properly documented in the first place. Elaine Loomis cooperated with the investigation, sitting for interviews where she answered questions about her husband's final weeks with a clarity that surprised even her. The passage of time had given her distance from the raw grief of those early years, allowing her to recall details that she had suppressed or overlooked. She remembered Gareth mentioning a conversation with his supervisor, how Dalton had seemed unusually interested in whether he had discussed the shipment with anyone else. She remembered finding a business card in his jacket pocket a few days before he vanished, a card from a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower protection, though Gareth had never mentioned contacting anyone about workplace concerns. These small pieces, overlooked or dismissed during the original investigation, now formed part of a larger picture that Sarah was painstakingly assembling. The community's reaction to the reopened case was complex, a mixture of renewed interest and uncomfortable questions about how such a thing could have happened without anyone noticing. The dockyard's current management issued statements expressing cooperation with authorities and emphasizing that the facility now operated under completely different oversight and security protocols. Local news covered the story extensively, interviewing former workers who remembered Gareth and psychologists who spoke about the lasting impact of unsolved disappearances on families and communities. Some of the old rumors resurfaced, stories about strange sounds and shadows, now recontextualized by the discovery in the container, given weight by the possibility that they had been more than just superstition. As months passed, the investigation yielded incremental progress rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Dalton Kerr agreed to testify against others involved in the smuggling operation in exchange for a reduced sentence on charges of obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. Federal prosecutors built cases against several individuals who had been part of the pharmaceutical trafficking network, using Gareth's disappearance as leverage to encourage cooperation from those willing to provide information in exchange for leniency. But the central question of what had ultimately happened to Gareth remained frustratingly elusive. Without a body, without witnesses willing to provide direct testimony, the truth existed in a space of probability and inference rather than certainty. Sarah spent long hours reviewing the evidence, looking for connections that others might have missed. She studied maps of the dockyard from 1993, identifying all the locations where someone could have been taken, where evidence might have been hidden. She interviewed retired police officers who had worked the original case, listening to their theories and regrets, their admissions of avenues they hadn't pursued because of limited resources or departmental politics. She visited the warehouse where the container had been found, standing in the empty space and trying to imagine the fear that Gareth must have felt, trapped in darkness with people who meant him harm, wondering if anyone would come looking for him. The discovery of additional evidence came not through traditional police work, but through the kind of chance occurrence that often defines cold cases. A construction crew working on a new development near the old industrial district unearthed a section of buried pipe that had been used for drainage decades earlier. Inside the corroded metal, protected from decomposition by the anaerobic environment, they found a wallet and a set of keys wrapped in a plastic bag. The wallet belonged to Gareth Loomis, identified by the driver's license still visible through the clouded plastic window, and the keys matched those that had been missing from his truck. The location was significant, barely 300 yards from where his vehicle had been found abandoned, in an area that had been subjected to only cursory searches during the original investigation. Forensic analysis of the pipe and surrounding soil provided new information that fundamentally altered the investigation's direction. The plastic bag showed evidence of having been placed there deliberately, not washed into the drainage system by accident, suggesting that someone had hidden these items with the intention of preventing their discovery. Soil samples contained trace elements consistent with the industrial area where the dockyard was located, and pollen analysis indicated that the bag had been buried during the autumn, consistent with the time of Gareth's disappearance. Most significantly, DNA evidence recovered from inside the wallet, from skin cells and hair that had been trapped in its folds, included material from the unidentified individual whose cigarette butts had been found in the container. This connection provided the breakthrough that Sarah had been searching for. The DNA was run through expanded databases, including international repositories and genealogical services that had become increasingly useful in criminal investigations. A partial match appeared, indicating a familial relationship to someone whose DNA was on file for unrelated reasons. Through patient genealogical research, investigators identified a possible subject, a man named Vincent Hale, who had worked as a security contractor at the dockyard during the early 1990s and who had since moved through a series of jobs that kept him on the margins of legitimate employment. When police located and interviewed him, confronting him with the DNA evidence, his composure cracked, and after hours of questioning, he provided a statement that finally answered the question that had haunted Elaine Loomis for 24 years. Vincent described how he had been hired to intimidate Gareth, to convince him that asking questions about irregular shipments was dangerous for his health and his family's safety. He claimed he had never intended for things to escalate, that the plan had been simply to scare the dock worker into silence. But Gareth had been resistant, Vincent said, more courageous than anyone had anticipated. When threats hadn't worked, when it became clear that he intended to report what he knew to authorities, the situation had spiraled beyond Vincent's control. He admitted to being present when Gareth had been taken to the container, to spending hours trying to break his resolve, but he insisted that, when he had left that night, the dock worker had still been alive, bound but breathing, with the understanding that someone else would deal with the situation. What happened after Vincent's departure remained unclear even with his testimony, lost in the void of deniability that criminals construct around the worst of their actions. Other members of the smuggling operation were either dead, unreachable, or unwilling to provide information that would implicate them in something more serious than drug trafficking. The most likely scenario, Sarah concluded based on all available evidence, was that Gareth had died in that container, whether from medical distress brought on by the trauma and confinement or through more direct means. His body had then been disposed of in a way that had so far prevented its recovery, possibly in the river that flowed past the dockyard, possibly in one of the many abandoned industrial sites that dotted the area, locations where a thorough search would be practically impossible decades after the fact. Elaine received this information in Sarah's office, sitting in the same chair where countless family members of victims had sat before her, hearing words that provided answers without offering peace. She listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her face reflecting a lifetime of waiting compressed into this single conversation. When Sarah had finished explaining everything they had learned, everything they believed had happened, Elaine nodded slowly and asked the question that mattered most to her. Had her husband been brave? Sarah assured her that yes, Gareth had been extraordinarily brave, that he had stood up against people who meant him harm because he believed in doing the right thing, and that his courage had ultimately helped bring some measure of justice, even if it had come far too late. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and unsatisfying in the way that delayed justice often is. Vincent Hale was charged with kidnapping and conspiracy, facing a sentence that would likely keep him imprisoned for the rest of his functional life. Several others connected to the smuggling operation received lesser charges, their cooperation buying them reduced sentences in a system that valued information over accountability. Dalton Kerr, whose testimony had been crucial to building the case, served minimal time due to his age and health, spending his remaining years in a kind of self-imposed exile, estranged from family members who couldn't reconcile the grandfather they knew with the man who had enabled such suffering. The dockyard itself underwent another transformation, this time symbolic rather than physical. A small memorial was placed near where Warehouse 7 had stood, a plaque bearing Gareth's name and dates, acknowledging his existence and the injustice of his disappearance. It was Elaine who unveiled it, now in her 70s, supported by children who had grown up with a father's absence as a defining fact of their lives. Local officials made speeches about worker safety and corporate responsibility, words that meant little to those who understood how easily such tragedies could be forgotten or ignored when profit and convenience demanded it. In the years that followed, the case became a reference point for other investigations, an example of how cold cases could be solved through persistence and technological advancement. Law enforcement agencies used it in training, teaching new detectives about the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining hope, even when leads seemed exhausted. True crime documentaries featured the story, interviews with Sarah and Elaine providing human context to the procedural details, ensuring that Gareth's name would be remembered beyond the immediate circle of those who had known him. For Elaine, the resolution brought something that wasn't quite closure but resembled acceptance, a final chapter to a story that had defined her adult life. She could visit the memorial now, could speak to the plaque as she once spoke to an empty house, and feel that her words were reaching someone rather than dissolving into silence. She thought often about the courage Sarah had mentioned, about the man she had married who had chosen integrity over safety, and she tried to find comfort in the knowledge that his last act had been one of principle, even if the price had been unimaginably high. The container that had held Gareth's belongings was eventually destroyed, cut apart and recycled like countless others, its metal returned to the industrial cycle from which it had come. But photographs remained, evidence preserved in case files and digital archives, ensuring that this particular sealed box would never be entirely forgotten. It stood as a reminder of how easily people could disappear, how the machinery of commerce and crime could grind forward regardless of individual lives, and how justice, when it finally arrived, often came too late to matter in the ways that mattered most. The truth, when it finally emerged in its fullest form, did not arrive as a single revelation, but rather as a series of small discoveries that accumulated over months like sediment forming rock. Sarah Winters found herself returning again and again to the evidence room where Gareth's belongings were stored, studying the canvas jacket and the rusted lunch box as though they might yield secrets beyond what forensic analysis had already extracted. She had solved the case in the technical sense, had identified those responsible and built prosecutions that would result in convictions, but the detective in her understood that solving and understanding were not the same thing. There remained gaps in the narrative, spaces where conjecture had to substitute for certainty, and these absences troubled her in ways that kept her working long after the official investigation had been closed. It was during one of these late evening visits to the evidence room that she noticed something she had previously overlooked, a detail so small that it had been catalogued but not analyzed. Inside the lunch box, tucked into a corner beneath where the thermos had rested, was a photograph that had survived the years remarkably well, protected by the metal container and the dry conditions of the warehouse. The image showed Gareth and Elaine on what appeared to be a vacation, standing before an ocean backdrop, both of them younger than Sarah had ever seen them, their smiles genuine and unguarded. On the back, in Gareth's handwriting, was a date and a single word: forever. Sarah held the photograph for a long time, understanding suddenly why Gareth had carried it to work, why it had been in his lunch box that final day. He had taken it into the container with him, this small token of the life he was trying to protect, the future he believed he was fighting for. The realization transformed her understanding of those final hours, adding emotional texture to what had been merely a sequence of events. Gareth had not been just a victim of circumstance or a casualty of organized crime. He had been a man making conscious choices, weighing his fear against his principles, and ultimately deciding that some things mattered more than safety. She made copies of the photograph and brought one to Elaine during her next visit, watching as the older woman's face softened at the sight of it. Elaine touched the image gently, tracing the outline of her younger self with a fingertip that trembled slightly. She remembered the day clearly. She said, a weekend trip they had taken early in their marriage when money was tight but hope was abundant. They had stayed in a cheap motel and walked the beach for hours, talking about dreams that seemed achievable simply because they were young enough to believe in their own invincibility. The photograph had disappeared when Gareth did, and she had assumed it lost along with everything else, never imagining that it had been with him at the end, a reminder of what he was protecting. The trial of Vincent Hale proceeded through the criminal justice system, with the grinding inevitability of bureaucratic process. Sarah testified for 2 days, walking the jury through the evidence and the timeline, explaining how DNA and circumstantial details had converged to tell a story of intimidation that had escalated beyond anyone's control. Vincent's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been merely a contractor following orders, that he had not been responsible for whatever ultimate fate had befallen Gareth Loomis, but the prosecution countered with phone records and financial transactions that showed a pattern of involvement too deep to dismiss as peripheral. When the verdict came back guilty on multiple counts, Sarah felt satisfaction without joy. The hollow victory of justice delayed so long that it could never truly compensate for what had been taken. Elaine attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the gallery with her adult children beside her, their presence a reminder of all the years Gareth had missed, the graduations and weddings and grandchildren he would never meet. When given the opportunity to address the court, she stood with a steadiness that surprised even herself and spoke directly to Vincent Hale, who could not bring himself to meet her gaze. She did not rage or weep, did not demand vengeance or express hatred. Instead, she spoke about what had been lost, about a man who had worked with his hands and lived with integrity, about children who had grown up answering questions about their father's absence with uncertainty and pain. She spoke about the weight of not knowing, how it differed from the grief of confirmed loss, how it prevented healing in ways that people who had never experienced such limbo could not understand. Her words affected the courtroom in ways that legal arguments had not, creating a silence that felt almost sacred in its heaviness. Even the judge, a man who had presided over countless criminal proceedings with professional detachment, seemed moved by the simple dignity of her statement. When Elaine finished and returned to her seat, her daughter squeezed her hand, and Sarah, watching from the prosecutor's table, felt tears she had been holding back for months finally break free. The sentence that followed was substantial. Decades in prison that would ensure Vincent Hale would die behind bars. But everyone in that courtroom understood that no punishment could truly balance the scales of what had been done. In the weeks after the trial concluded, Sarah found herself thinking about the nature of her work, about the cold cases that filled filing cabinets and digital databases, each one representing a story that had been interrupted, a narrative denied its proper conclusion. She had always approached her job with methodical professionalism, but Gareth's case had affected her differently, had reminded her that behind every file number and evidence bag was a human being whose absence rippled through time, affecting not just those who had known them but generations that followed. She began reaching out to other families of cold case victims, offering updates on cases that had languished for years, sometimes with new information, but often simply to acknowledge that someone still cared, that their loved ones had not been forgotten. One of these families was the Morrison clan, whose patriarch had disappeared from the same dockyard 5 years before Gareth, under circumstances that had been dismissed as a voluntary departure, a man walking away from debts and responsibilities. But Sarah, reading through the old file with fresh eyes, informed by what she now knew about the dockyard's criminal operations, saw patterns that suggested something more sinister. She reopened the investigation quietly, working it alongside her other cases, and within months had developed evidence that connected Jacob Morrison's disappearance to the same smuggling network that had targeted Gareth. The discovery led to additional charges against several individuals already facing prosecution, and it gave the Morrison family something they had been denied for decades: acknowledgement that their father had not abandoned them, that his disappearance had not been a choice but a crime. This expansion of the investigation revealed the true scope of what had been operating at the dockyard during those years, a criminal enterprise that had functioned with remarkable longevity, because it had operated in the shadows of legitimate commerce, because it had been protected by people like Dalton Kerr, who valued their payoffs more than their conscience. Federal prosecutors estimated that the smuggling operation had moved millions of dollars worth of illicit pharmaceuticals through the facility over a span of nearly 2 decades, with profits distributed among a network of corrupt officials, security contractors, and organized crime figures. The human cost of this enterprise was harder to quantify, but no less real. Workers who had disappeared or been intimidated into silence, families destroyed by uncertainty, a community's trust eroded by the knowledge that such things could happen undetected for so long. The media coverage of these revelations was extensive, with journalists investigating not just the crimes themselves, but the systemic failures that had enabled them. Reports detailed how budget cuts and political pressure had limited regulatory oversight at the dockyard, how shipping companies had resisted security improvements that might have detected the smuggling, how law enforcement agencies had failed to share information effectively because of jurisdictional pride and bureaucratic inertia. Some of this coverage was sensationalized, reducing complex institutional problems to simple narratives of good and evil, but much of it prompted genuine reflection about how such tragedies could be prevented in the future. The dockyard's current ownership, facing public relations disaster and potential liability, commissioned an independent review of historical security practices and implemented comprehensive reforms intended to prevent similar abuses. These changes included enhanced surveillance systems, mandatory training on recognizing signs of criminal activity, and anonymous reporting mechanisms that would allow workers to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Cynics noted that these reforms came only after the damage had been done, after lives had been lost and families shattered, But others argued that if Gareth's death could prevent future tragedies, then perhaps something meaningful could be salvaged from senseless loss. Elaine watched these developments with mixed feelings, proud that her husband's name had become associated with positive change, but resentful that such change had required his sacrifice. She found herself becoming an advocate for families of missing persons, speaking at conferences and working with organizations that provided support services to those navigating the nightmare of unresolved disappearances. Her message was simple but powerful. The absence of a body does not mean the absence of a crime, and families deserve answers even when those answers come too late to change the past. She spoke from experience about the particular torture of ambiguity, how the mind cannot properly grieve when hope and despair exist simultaneously, how closure requires not just knowledge but acknowledgement from institutions and authorities that a wrong has been committed and will not be forgotten. Through this advocacy work, Elaine met others whose stories paralleled her own, people who had spent years or decades waiting for answers that might never come. She found unexpected comfort in these connections, in the shared understanding that required no explanation, because they all spoke the same language of loss. They formed a community bound not by choice, but by circumstance, supporting each other through the anniversaries and triggers that others could not comprehend, celebrating small victories like reopened investigations or recovered evidence, with an intensity that outsiders might find disproportionate, but which made perfect sense to those who understood how much such things mattered. One of the people Elaine grew closest to was Margaret Morrison, Jacob's widow, who had spent decades believing her husband had abandoned their family only to learn that he had died trying to protect them. The two women, separated by years but united by parallel tragedies, spent hours talking about their experiences, finding patterns in their grief and their survival. They spoke about the guilt that came with moving forward, with experiencing joy despite the absence of those they loved, about the ways their children had been shaped by growing up in households haunted by unanswered questions. These conversations were painful but necessary, creating space for emotions that had been suppressed or denied for too long. Sarah stayed in contact with both women, checking in regularly not just as a detective, but as someone who had become personally invested in their healing. She attended memorial services and anniversary vigils, bearing witness to rituals of remembrance that kept vanished men present in the lives of those who survived them. During one such gathering, held at the Dockyard Memorial on what would have been Gareth's 70th birthday, Sarah found herself standing beside Elaine, both of them looking at the plaque that bore his name alongside Jacob Morrison's and 3 others whose disappearances had been connected to the criminal enterprise. The memorial had grown since its initial installation, expanded to acknowledge all the victims whose lives had intersected with the dockyard's dark history. Each name was accompanied by dates and a small space where family members could leave offerings, flowers, photographs, small objects that held personal meaning. Gareth's section held the ocean photograph, laminated now to protect it from weather, along with a pair of work gloves that Elaine had placed there, symbols of the labor and integrity that had defined his life. Sarah noticed that someone had left a single cigarette beside Vincent Hale's name carved into the stone, and she quietly removed it, unwilling to let even symbolic gestures corrupt this space of remembrance. As they stood there in silence, other family members arriving to pay their respects, Sarah thought about the trajectory that had brought them to this moment. The case had consumed 2 years of her professional life, had occupied her thoughts during sleepless nights and distracted moments, had challenged her to look beyond procedural requirements toward something more fundamental about justice and human dignity. She had learned things about persistence and patience, about the importance of details that seemed insignificant until context revealed their meaning, about the ways that truth could be buried but never completely destroyed. These lessons would inform every case she worked for the rest of her career, would make her a better detective, but also a more empathetic human being. Elaine, for her part, had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed, had transformed grief into purpose in ways that honored Gareth's memory while creating her own legacy. She thought about the woman she had been during those first days after his disappearance, paralyzed by uncertainty and fear, unable to imagine a future that did not include him. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she could remember but no longer recognize as herself. The intervening years had carved her into something harder but also more resilient, had taught her that survival was not about forgetting or moving on, but about carrying loss in ways that did not consume you entirely. The children they had raised, now adults with families of their own, had been shaped by their father's absence in ways both obvious and subtle. They had learned early that the world was not always fair, that good people could suffer for doing right. That certainty was a luxury not everyone possessed. These lessons had made them cautious, but also compassionate, had given them appreciation for the everyday stability that others took for granted. When they spoke about Gareth to their own children, they emphasized his courage and principles, creating a legacy based not on how he died, but on how he lived, ensuring that his grandchildren would know their grandfather as more than just a tragic story. The legal proceedings finally concluded nearly 3 years after the container had been reopened, with the last of the connected cases resolved through plea bargains or verdicts. Sarah compiled a comprehensive report documenting everything that had been learned, creating a resource that would be available to researchers and law enforcement for years to come. The document ran to hundreds of pages, dense with evidence and testimony, but she wrote a shorter executive summary that focused on the human elements of the case, on the workers who had disappeared and the families left behind, on the systemic failures that had enabled criminal enterprise to flourish undetected. This summary was distributed widely, used in training sessions and policy discussions, becoming a reference point for conversations about worker safety and corporate accountability. In one of their last official meetings, Sarah gave Elaine a copy of the full report, along with all the evidence that had been collected, items that would be returned to the family now that legal proceedings had concluded. They sat in Sarah's office, which had become familiar territory over the months of investigation, and went through each piece carefully. Elaine held the canvas jacket, running her fingers over the worn fabric, remembering the countless times she had mended its tears and washed grease from its seams. She opened the lunch box, noting how the rust had spread since she had last seen it, entropy claiming what memory tried to preserve. And she looked again at the photograph, at the young couple frozen in a moment of uncomplicated happiness, and she allowed herself to remember not just what had been lost, but what had been lived. Sarah asked if there was anything else Elaine needed, any question that remained unanswered, any aspect of the investigation that required further explanation. Elaine considered for a moment, then asked the question that had haunted her since the beginning. Did Gareth know, in those final hours, that people would look for him, that his death would matter beyond the immediate crime, that truth would eventually emerge even if it took decades? Sarah could not answer with certainty, because no one could know what thoughts had occupied Gareth's mind as he sat bound in that container. But she offered her belief that yes, he must have known, must have understood that the life he had built and the love he had earned would ensure that he would not be forgotten. This answer seemed to satisfy something in Elaine, seemed to complete a circuit that had been open for too long. She thanked Sarah with genuine warmth, acknowledging the dedication and persistence that had brought them to this point, recognizing that the detective had given her something precious. Not just answers, but validation, confirmation that her husband's life had mattered and his death had not been meaningless. They embraced briefly, two women who had been brought together by tragedy, but who had found in each other a kind of kinship that transcended professional obligation. In the months that followed, life gradually returned to rhythms that resembled normalcy, though both women carried the case with them in ways that would never fully fade. Sarah took on new investigations, applied the lessons learned from Gareth's case to other mysteries that demanded unraveling. She found herself more patient with witnesses, more willing to pursue leads that seemed unlikely, more committed to ensuring that victims and their families received the attention they deserved regardless of how much time had passed. Her solve rate improved, her reputation grew, but more importantly, she felt that her work had purpose beyond statistics and career advancement. Elaine continued her advocacy, speaking at events and working with organizations dedicated to missing persons cases. She testified before legislative committees considering bills to improve resources for cold case investigations, bringing a personal perspective that statistics and expert testimony could not match. Some of these efforts resulted in concrete changes: increased funding for forensic laboratories and training programs for detectives specializing in historical cases. Other initiatives stalled in political gridlock or budgetary constraints, but Elaine persisted, understanding that change was incremental and that each small victory represented progress, even when larger goals remained out of reach. On the 5th anniversary of the container's discovery, the dockyard held a ceremony to rededicate the memorial, expanding it into a proper monument that included detailed plaques explaining the history of what had happened and why it mattered. Local officials attended along with family members of all the victims, union representatives, and worker safety advocates, media covering the event for evening news broadcasts. Elaine was asked to speak, and she stood before the gathered crowd, now in her late 70s but still possessing the dignity and strength that had carried her through decades of uncertainty. She spoke about Gareth not as a victim but as a hero, a man who had recognized injustice and refused to ignore it even when silence would have been safer. She spoke about the importance of remembering not just what was lost, but why it was lost, about the responsibility that survivors and society had to ensure such tragedies did not repeat. And she spoke about hope, about the possibility of finding meaning in suffering, about the ways that truth could heal even when it came too late to prevent pain. Her words were measured and thoughtful, free of bitterness or rage, reflecting years of processing and perspective that had transformed grief into wisdom. When the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Elaine remained at the memorial with her children and grandchildren. 3 generations gathered around the stone that bore Gareth's name. The youngest grandchildren did not fully understand the significance of the moment, but they sensed its importance in the way adults spoke in hushed tones and moved with careful reverence. The older ones, teenagers now, had grown up hearing stories about the grandfather they had never met, had absorbed his legacy through family narratives and their grandmother's advocacy work. They understood, perhaps better than children in more conventional circumstances, that one person's choices could ripple across time, affecting lives not yet lived when those choices were made. As evening approached and the family prepared to leave, Elaine's daughter asked if she was ready to go, if she had said everything she needed to say. Elaine nodded but did not move immediately, taking a final moment to stand before the memorial in solitude. She thought about the young woman in the photograph, standing beside the ocean with her whole life ahead of her, believing in forever with the certainty that only youth allows. That woman could not have imagined the path that lay ahead, the years of uncertainty and the eventual resolution, the pain that would become purpose and the loss that would become legacy. But she would have recognized in her older self something essential that had survived everything, the love that had sustained her through impossible years, the commitment to truth that Gareth had died defending, the belief that some things mattered enough to fight for regardless of cost. She touched the stone gently, a gesture of connection across the barrier between living and dead, and whispered words that no one else heard, a private communication that needed no witness. Then she turned and walked back to her family, moving with the careful steps of age but also with the confidence of someone who had faced the worst and survived, who had found meaning in tragedy and built something worthwhile from ruins. Behind her, the memorial stood solid and permanent, a marker in stone of lives that would not be forgotten, of truths that had taken decades to emerge but which had finally, inevitably, come to light. Sarah watched from her car as the family departed, having come to the ceremony but remained at the periphery, respecting the space that families needed for private grief. She felt satisfied in ways that transcended professional accomplishment, knowing that her work had contributed to something larger than case closure or conviction rates. The investigation had given Elaine, and others like her, something irreplaceable. The knowledge that their loved ones had not been abandoned by justice, that institutional memory could be made to bend toward truth even when forces of convenience and corruption worked against it. As she drove away from the dockyard, passing through the industrial landscape that had been the backdrop for so much suffering and eventual redemption, Sarah thought about the nature of her calling. Police work at its best was about more than enforcing laws or solving puzzles. It was about bearing witness to human experience in its rawest forms, about standing between chaos and order, about insisting that every life mattered enough to warrant effort and attention. Gareth Loomis had been one man among millions, unremarkable in most ways that society measured significance, but his story had revealed something essential about courage and consequence, about the price of integrity and the value of persistence. The case would remain with her always, a reference point against which other investigations would be measured, a reminder of why she had chosen this profession and what it demanded from those who practiced it with full commitment. She had given Elaine answers, but Elaine had given her something equally valuable, an example of how dignity could be maintained through impossible circumstances, how love could endure beyond death and absence, how meaning could be constructed from tragedy if one refused to let suffering have the final word. The river continued to flow past the dockyard as it always had, carrying with it the smell of industry and commerce, the daily business of human enterprise proceeding regardless of individual stories. But now, on the bank where containers were still stacked in towering columns and cranes moved cargo between vessels and trucks, there stood a monument that insisted on memory, that declared certain things too important to forget. Workers passing the memorial might pause briefly, reading names and dates, connecting abstract history to the concrete present, understanding that the space they occupied for their shifts had once been the site of choices that still echoed across time. Gareth Loomis had clocked out for the last time nearly 3 decades ago, walking toward a parking lot and a truck he would never reach, carrying in his lunch box a photograph of his wife and a determination to do what was right despite danger. That moment had defined everything that followed, had set in motion investigations and revelations, had created ripples that touched lives he had never known, and would influence decisions made long after his death. He could not have anticipated any of this, could not have known that his stand against corruption would eventually lead to systemic reforms and bring closure to other families, could not have imagined the legacy his final choices would create. That truth mattered not because it always prevailed, but because people like him refused to stop defending it. That justice existed not as an inevitable outcome, but as a possibility that required constant effort and sacrifice. That ordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds was the foundation upon which all meaningful change was built. These realizations, if he had reached them, would have been cold comfort in the darkness of that sealed metal space, but they would have been true nonetheless, and truth was what he had died protecting. The story ended not with his death but with what came after, with the detective who refused to let the case remain closed, with the widow who transformed grief into advocacy, with the community that chose to remember rather than forget. It ended with a memorial standing against industrial sky, with names carved in stone, with flowers placed by hands that had never touched those they mourned, but understood the importance of bearing witness. It ended with the acknowledgement that some disappearances could be solved, that some mysteries could yield their secrets if enough people cared enough to keep asking questions, that the long arc of justice could bend toward truth even when decades separated crime from consequence. And it ended with hope, fragile but persistent, that the lessons learned and the changes implemented might prevent future tragedies, might protect other workers from facing the same impossible choice that Gareth had confronted, might ensure that the machinery of commerce and law would value human life above profit and convenience. This hope was not naive, was tempered by realistic understanding of how slowly institutions changed and how easily reforms could be eroded, but it was hope nonetheless. And in a world where so much remained uncertain and unjust, hope was both necessary and defiant. The sun set over the dockyard, casting long shadows across containers and pavement, painting the river with bands of orange and gold. The day's work concluded, engines fell silent, and workers made their way home to families and routines, their departures unremarkable because they were expected, because they would return tomorrow to continue the labor that sustained them. Among them moved the memory of a man who had not returned, whose absence had become presence through the monument that bore his name, whose story had been transformed from private tragedy to public testimony about courage and consequence. Elaine stood at her kitchen window that evening, looking out at the street just as she had done decades before while waiting for a truck that never arrived. But now the waiting was over, replaced by knowledge that was painful but preferable to uncertainty, by understanding that allowed for grieving in ways that ambiguity had prevented. She thought about forever, that word written on the back of a photograph, that promise made by young people who could not comprehend all it would require. Forever had come to mean something different than they had imagined on that ocean beach so many years ago. Not a lifetime spent together, but a love that persisted beyond separation, a connection that death had interrupted but not severed. She turned from the window and moved through the house, past photographs that charted their life together and the lives their children had built, past the empty spaces that had once held his presence. The house was quiet but not silent, filled with the accumulated resonance of decades lived, of memories that had become part of its foundation as surely as concrete and wood. And somewhere in that accumulation, in the texture of daily existence that continued despite absence, Gareth remained, not as ghost or fantasy, but as the enduring influence of a life lived with integrity, of choices made for right reasons, of love given freely and received completely. This was the truth that had emerged from years of investigation and waiting, from evidence pieced together and testimony reluctantly given. That one person's courage could matter, that justice delayed was still justice, that memory properly maintained could become monument and lesson. It was not the ending anyone would have chosen, was marked by loss that could never be fully compensated, but it was an ending nonetheless, a completion of narrative that allowed survivors to write new chapters informed by but not imprisoned by the past. The container that had held Gareth's final hours had been destroyed, but the story it told lived on, carried forward by those who refused to let it be forgotten, who insisted that his name means something beyond the circumstances of his death. And in this insistence, in this determination to find meaning in tragedy and to build something worthwhile from ruins, there was redemption of a kind, imperfect, and incomplete but real, a testament to the human capacity to endure and transcend even the darkest chapters of our collective experience.